Welcome to Mamahood After Trauma, where healing and mamahood intersect. I'm Emily, your host. Join us as we discover practical strategies to nurture ourselves with kindness and understanding. Stay tuned for insights and inspiration to support you on your path of healing and growth. Let's dive in together. This is Mamahood After Trauma. Hello, my friends, and welcome to this episode of the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. I am so excited that you have taken some time out of your busy mama schedule to tune in and listen to our conversation. Today, we are being joined by Mel. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I'm excited to have this conversation. So let's dive right in. Mel, can you share a little bit of your story? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm a mom of two. I have a 9 and 6-year-old now. I live on Vancouver Island in Canada, and I didn't always live here. I did grow up in Canada, but I lived in the UK for many years. Right after university, I went to the UK and lived there for 14 years. And that's where I had my kids. And we were only planning on being there for 1 to 2 years. And it just kind of surprised us that we stayed longer. And it was a really great time in so many ways, building yourself from scratch, really, because I didn't know a single person. That was really interesting. And then having kids there away from family. And in some ways it was nice because we dedicated a lot of money and time to traveling back home and making sure that grandparents saw the grandkids and such. But we got to see them for 2 to 3 weeks at a time as opposed to an hour here and there. But it was really hard. It was really hard to have kids away from family. And I had friends over there, but most of them were in different stages of their life as well. So I had to really reevaluate, like reinvent, I think, my identity a little bit when I had my first child. And I should say, just going back a little bit from there, I I wasn't one of those people who grew up thinking like my dream is to have a kid,
Mm,
right? I know people like that's their big dream. I always figured it would happen though. I always figured that was just like a thing that happens in your life. They teach you that like one slip up in like you're
yeah,
pregnant. Um, which is like I get why we teach that in high school, but it also sets us up for failure when it's a lot harder to get pregnant.
yeah,
And that was a big part of my journey. We tried for 3 years, had nothing, and then ended up having IVF in the UK. We were so grateful at the time, honestly, because we managed to be in a location, like specifically the county that we lived in,
mm-hmm.
that gave 3 free rounds of IVF. So I was like super grateful there, but it was really difficult to it was it was a difficult journey in and of itself, right? So
Yeah,
like hormones, you're literally putting hormones into your body that aren't normally there. And something that if you've never done IVF, the first thing that you do is go on birth control. It's the weirdest thing, right?
yeah,
Um, anyway, so just that's just to regulate like they know then what's happening when. But so we were successful in the first round getting pregnant, and then we had a miscarriage a few weeks in, and that was devastating. And managed to do a frozen round shortly after, and my daughter was born from that. So she was a frozen embryo for what, 6, 7 months. She knows that. It's quite funny. Um, yeah. So, anyways, that was part of our journey of really like healing and figure out like like how badly do we want this? And
mm-hmm.
I feel like one of the first times in my life that like I realized that things don't just happen the way people tell you they're gonna happen.
Oh yeah,
Um, yeah, so I could go on and on, but depends which direction we want to go on the story. But that was definitely the beginning of it. And the
Well,
second one was not IVF, by the way. He was natural in the end, which was a big surprise. And also great.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, how was the transition from um, struggling with fertility
Yeah.
to transitioning into parenthood away from family? Because
Yeah.
that is traumatic. Like both of those things are traumatic all on their own. And then
Yeah.
you're left to figure it out pretty much by yourself without the support of family.
Yeah, it was really tricky, and not knowing the system in the UK as well, we had to learn how that worked. My first birth was also very traumatic. I was in the hospital for 9 days afterwards,
Oh wow.
and both of us were on antibiotics, and I had almost bled out, and it was quite a lot of trauma involved in that. And interestingly, I think, no matter what the detail of that trauma is, the
Yeah.
part that was like the hardest is that I trusted the doctors. I trusted that they would know what to do. And in the end, afterwards, I was like, I wouldn't have made those choices, right?
Mm,
Because we were induced early. So, because of gestational diabetes, which was under control and all these things. So I felt like I had no control over anything. And that's often where trauma comes, right?
yeah.
Um, so that was really, I kind of pushed it down for a while afterwards. I
Yeah.
felt grateful that it had worked out in the end. My husband was actually more traumatized than me, I'd say, because he was like this watching figure that didn't have anything to do. Um, but the first 3 years with my daughter, I actually felt like I was meant to be a mom. I was like, this is
Wow.
amazing. Um, I should say the first 6 months were the hardest thing I've ever done in my life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, she was sick as well, and there was just all these things that happened, and readjusting my identity to that was
Mm-hmm.
challenging. But I brought her along. She was this like, my family kept saying she's an easy kid, which I don't think any baby is easy. They're always a lot of,
No.
but I could bring her along to like meetings I had with people in the cafe, and I brought her to conferences and like all sorts, and she'd just sit there and like do her thing. Then I had a second kid.
Oh man.
And like, oh man, exactly. I felt like I had control of my life, like I could still like live the life I wanted with one, with two, and this is a totally different child with traits of movement and high emotion and loud emotion and all the things. All of a sudden, I didn't have quite as much support as I did in the first one, even just from
Mm-hmm.
friends, because it's second child, so it just happens that way. And I was stuck. I was like, I that was the hardest time of my life, honestly.
Mm.
Um, the trauma of the first birth comes back during the second.
Mm-hmm.
We did do some work with that. We worked with a hypnobirthing person who did some trauma work with us to really desensitize that and gain control over the second birth. That was really, really helpful. I had the most detailed birth plan you've probably ever seen. It had pictures and everything. And I should say that's not saying that we have choice over everything that happens during our birth.
No.
Do have, well, actually we do, but we have a choice of what we do with what happens in our birth.
Yes.
That's the difference, right?
Yes.
And that's how I wrote it. It was like, if this happens, because I understand that this might happen, these are my choices that I would prefer and less emergency kind of thing, right? Um, anyways, so that like my second child, when he was a baby, and I would say in his own way now still, like everything's a 10.
Yep.
There's no in between, right?
Yeah.
And as a now I identify and know that I am a highly sensitive person. So my hearing is my sensitive part, especially
Mm-hmm.
is super difficult for me. So I was overstimulated constantly,
Mm-hmm.
especially since you're tired and everything else that comes with the first while of birth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had ankle surgery about 9 months afterwards.
Oh man.
So I couldn't really move. And like, it was, it was really, really difficult. And the first time in my life that I was like, I think I might be depressed. Like
Mm.
I I didn't know what to do about that, but I just didn't feel like doing anything, right? So we had that initial, we had support, family came over in the beginning and such, but eventually my husband went back to work, and
Yeah.
he worked long hours and slightly unpredictable ones. I never knew when he was going to come home. And I remember many times when I would be sitting there nursing the littlest and the other one's like climbing on my back,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because she just wanted that attention too. She was used to having that attention. And of
Yeah.
course, I could give it to her before.
Mm-hmm.
And she had a sibling. I'm like, I can't meet both of your needs right now. You got to go over there. Right. I couldn't meet the needs of both kids, me, my partner, life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and still to this day, that's my trigger. If I
Mm-hmm.
can't meet these needs, because you can't meet everybody's needs. So
Yeah.
that's taken a lot of, and still takes a lot of personal work to work through that trigger when it comes up.
We interrupt this amazing conversation for a word from our sponsor. Are you tired of feeling like you're on an emotional roller coaster in mamahood? Ready to break free from the fear and frustration that's holding you back? Introducing Mama Untriggered, private podcast series, a transformative 5-episode journey to help you calm your nervous system and reclaim your strength in mamahood. In each episode, we'll guide you through practical, actionable steps to understand your triggers, build your trigger toolbox, and harness the power of community for support. Say goodbye to those moments of overwhelm and hello to more peaceful, empowered you. You didn't become a mama to spend your day on edge. It's time to take control of your emotional well-being and create a positive, joyful experience for you and your littles. Ready to break free from the emotional roller coaster? Subscribe now to the Mama Untriggered private podcast series and start your journey to a calmer, happier mamahood today.
Because it does frequently.
Yeah.
And ground myself and be like, that's what it is. Have an awareness that that's what it is. Meet your own needs first.
So
And yeah,
how did you discover, how did you pinpoint that that was the trigger?
a lot of years. A reflection, honestly, because I think in the moment, in the darkest moments, that's not what you're thinking. You're
That's
probably
not what you're
thinking,
thinking
you're
about,
not
no.
thinking, right? You're not. And um, all I was doing in survival mode was just saying, like, I don't know. I wasn't saying anything of much and just complaining, really. Um, I think what helped in the end was, so we moved back to Canada um, when my son was almost 2. So March
Mm-hmm.
2020, as you can imagine what March 2020 looked like in the whole world. Everybody knows what March 2020 was, right? So height of the pandemic. We'd already decided to move. It just happened to arrive at that time. Everything amazingly did line up for us. We sold our house. We like literally like 2 weeks before they weren't letting you sell your house anymore in the UK, like it was major shutdown there. We got our stuff out, we had it into a shipping container. It was supposed to come and it sat there for 4 months because they weren't working. But we made it back. We flew back. Nobody got COVID. There weren't even masks at the time in England. So like, it's amazing that we did. And we came back and stayed with my parents-in-law for 3 months. But you know what? Like that next year, I was just like, I wasn't allowed to meet people. I was the loneliest I've ever felt. It's 8 hours ahead in the UK, so I couldn't really talk to my friends very often.
Mm-hmm.
And I just hung out with the kids. And
Yeah.
like glorious as that is, and we did some nice stuff, we're so fortunate to be on Vancouver Island where the numbers were low and we could go outside and do some beautiful stuff. But I was like, I don't know why I'm here and what am I doing? And like,
Yeah.
and for me, that's weird because I'm like this big dreamer, very purposeful, like I can always see a million choices, and I couldn't see any.
Mm.
And eventually, to go back to your question, what got me out of it is I started an online course to learn about applied positive psychology. So to learn how to flourish as a human and what the science says. And I did it. So it was online, but it was twice a week, 2 hours a week with the same people, a small group of,
Mm.
and a lot of it was conversational and group work. So I met some now great friends, right? Because we were all learning through this together. And I learned some of the tools that allow me to question my thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
moments, and be curious about others' reactions, my reactions, so that I'm less reactive,
Yeah.
essentially, right?
Yeah.
And that
So
made all the difference.
yeah. So what are some tips that you can share with our listeners that can help them to untrigger?
Yes, very good question. So I think there's one tool that I'd really like to share. It's called the Choice Map, and it's by Dr. Marilee Adams, and it's super visual, so I'll have to describe it. But you can literally just type in the Choice Map in Google so you can see the visual yourself if you're listening. But basically, this is how this is a really clear visual of how you get yourself into a space of curiosity. So you have two paths on it. One is the learner path, which goes up, and one is the judger path, which goes down. And especially when we're first learning
Mm-hmm.
about ourselves and our reactions and how to regulate, we go down the judger path very quickly,
Yeah.
right? So let's say something happens. Let's say um, the example coming to my head is I was just on a conversation just before you, and my son comes barreling into the room and because he needs to go to the bathroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my reaction is like, what the, like overwhelm,
Mm-hmm.
overstimulated right away. All these things in my head, judgments about um, like he's trying to wreck my day. And, like all these things come in that aren't
Mm-hmm.
true really, but they're statements. You assume the worst, either about the other person or about yourself,
Yeah.
right? About the circumstance. And that starts you going down the judger path. And what this choice map does, which is, I think, wonderful, is even if you start going down that one, there's a little path that goes up after the first thought or the second stop or the third stop. And you can switch lanes up to the learning path. And the way you do that is through questions that you ask yourself, such as, what assumptions am I making? Or, okay, what actually happened? What are the facts here? Um,
Mm.
like in his case, like, oh, like, why did he come in? Why did he feel it was so urgent? And not in a judgy way, but in a like actually curious of like,
Yeah.
why was that so important to him that he felt like he had to come and tell me that? And then you come to that answer, and then you ask yourself a question about that. And it's all questions, right?
Yeah.
Entering this space of curiosity, which then allows us to open to empathy and compassion and all those things. But we can't just say have empathy, right? We have to, for ourselves or others, it's about leaning into the choice or the questions that we can ask ourselves about what's happening. And you can start on that path once you've practiced, and when you're less triggered, you might
Yeah.
start going up the learner's path right away. Fantastic. Keep asking questions, keep going forward. And if we don't switch lanes, what happens is we end up in the judging pit, the judger's pit. And it is things like why are they so stupid? And you go down this really deep, dark space that doesn't feel good to yourself or anybody else, right? Um, so instead, let's accept that we're probably going to start on that path, because especially when you say triggers, which was the
Yeah.
question, that's right. How do we get out of the trigger? We're probably going to get triggered and react right away. And
Yeah.
then we can stop. Then we can, firstly, you might not be able to do this right in that instant, right?
Yeah.
Especially at first. Right in that instant, probably check in on your body and then do this. Check in your body first and say, what are my feet touching right now?
Yeah.
How do they feel on the ground? How do they feel on my shoes? And what's happening in my calves? And that just brings us back into our senses and out of the
Mm-hmm.
brain's part. And then we can start asking questions in our brain. We won't know the answers because we're still in reaction mode, right?
Yeah.
But we can start, it switches a different part of our brain on and starts us thinking in a different way. That's probably my favorite tool of all the things, because it's so visual as well.
Well, yeah. And you could use that, you could use those questions as journaling prompts.
Yep.
And like if answering them vocally or in your head
Yep.
is insufficient for you because everybody processes differently, um, writing or or drawing it out, maybe, like,
Yeah.
there are so many ways to respond to
Yeah.
those types of questions. I love
For
that.
sure. And catching yourself. The first step is
Yeah.
catch yourself and say, oh, I'm on the judger's path. And as soon as you notice that, it's easier to switch,
Yeah,
right?
it stops you from doing that downward spiral
Exactly.
that has a tendency to ruin your whole day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember when I was first learning this and I was in that really like hard space still and having all sorts of thoughts that I didn't want to have. And my relationship with my husband, and I would just get so frustrated at everything, because
Mhm.
I was frustrated about life, right? It had
Yeah.
nothing to do with the situation at hand. And I remember getting frustrated, and I would take my space. I would go upstairs, I would find my space, and I would start thinking after doing a little bit of regulation,
Mhm.
grounding. I would be like, okay, what is he thinking? What was he thinking about?
Yeah.
What was he feeling in that moment? Like getting out of my own space and being able to actually start to think and go, oh, huh, yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal, was it? Or sometimes it was, but he didn't realize it was, right? And it's kind
Yeah.
of, um, I definitely have found it super helpful to retrain my brain to think about things differently. Um,
Yeah. Get yourself out of the constant reactive state and
yeah,
into a space where you can respond
yeah,
with compassion and kindness and, you
yeah.
know,
To yourself as well.
yeah.
Right. Others, but
Yeah.
also to yourself, because judges' paths isn't just about how we judge others. This is
No.
about how we're
No.
judging ourselves too, right? Oh, I'm
Yeah.
so
And
stupid. Why do I always do this? All the things
oftentimes,
we say to ourselves. We're horrible to ourselves inside of our heads, right?
oftentimes we're harsher to ourselves than we are to other people.
Exactly. Exactly.
Like,
And what's that about? Like, would you ever
mm,
say that to somebody else? No. No, of course you wouldn't, right? So it's like, but noticing that is the first step. Noticing that you're on that judger's path and saying, and then giving yourself self-compassion, right? It's
yeah.
like, oh, it's okay. Everybody does this.
Hmm.
Like the worst thing we could do is notice and then be like, oh, and just spiral down and down and down, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's compassion is like the biggest thing, and it's so hard. Self-compassion is so hard and so, so important, especially for your listeners, right? They're gonna
Yeah.
have thoughts that aren't helping them anymore based on their
Oh,
experience,
yeah.
right?
And self-compassion is like any other muscle that
Mhm.
is in your body. You can't go to the gym once and have six-pack abs. It takes time.
Yeah.
So these types of um, exercises where you're working on retraining your brain, okay, take some time.
Yeah.
And sometimes you might feel like it's not working. But then one day it'll all just kind of click into place
Yeah.
and you'll be like, whoa, I didn't spiral.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But it takes that compassion first, right? And
Yeah.
the way I think about it, so like to put it out, I am not like a brain scientist. But what I do know and the way I visualize, because I'm a very visual person, how our brain works is that we have these neural pathways. And so I'll tell you the way I described riding a bike to my daughter when she first started, right? So she didn't get it right away when she
No.
went on the two-wheeler, right? And she would make mistakes and then she'd get it and then she wouldn't the next time. And it
Mm,
was frustrating for her. And so I started to try to describe to her how her brain worked, right? And then eventually she won't have to think about it anymore. Because in the beginning, she's thinking, I have to put my foot here, and then I need to do this, and then I put my hands here, and what happens if this happens? And you're thinking through every single little step. So I explained how right now your neural pathway in your brain is like a little piece of floss,
mm-hmm.
right? It's a little piece of floss. And every single time that you get on that bike, even for like 10 seconds, it's growing a little and little thicker. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually it becomes a rope. And when it's a rope, it's
Mm,
really easy for those thoughts to go back and forth. And it becomes like you don't even have to think about it, right? It becomes second nature to get on the bike and just go. And she was
yeah.
like, oh, right. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. That if you're like, I want to do this learner's path, I'm going to go check it out, this choice path, sorry. And it's hard at first. Like,
Yeah.
just know that that's because it's a floss. It's a piece of floss in your brain, right?
Yeah.
Don't
It's a
think
piece
about
of floss. Well, the self-judgment and that spiral is a
it. Yeah.
rope. So
Yeah. And
you
probably
have
even
to
more. Yeah,
you have to shift it because your
exactly.
nervous system didn't get in that state overnight. It took
Exactly.
time.
Yes.
It took
Yeah.
years for your nervous system to adopt the way that it is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's going to take time and patience and compassion to go the other direction.
Exactly. And that compassion comes in through noticing this. Like, so when you start beating
Mm,
yourself up for the fact that this is hard and why can't I get it and everybody else seems to get it and whatever else comes in your head, is like compassion is, oh, it's just a piece of floss right now and that's a piece of rope. That makes sense. Of
yeah,
course it is.
of course.
Like, my brain is just like everybody else's,
Hmm.
right? And whether it's this tool or another tool or anything you're trying that's new, this journey of self-discovery, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Brains are going to work with new information.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How can our listeners connect with you further if they'd like to do that?
So I have a podcast called Permission to Be Human, the podcast that you can find on wherever you look for podcasts. On Facebook, I'm also Permission to Be Human. If you Google that or search for it on Facebook, and you can just send me a direct email if you're interested as well, which is permission to be human always at gmail.com. This is the work that I love, all of
Mm,
this stuff. And I work with moms, especially around possibility and
yeah.
helping them see that. And these tools that we're talking about here are about getting us out of survival mode so that we can start to see possibility because we can't
Yes.
do it when we're in survival mode. And if you're
No.
beating yourself up for not being able to do it,
Mm,
it's because there's still a little bit of more work to do on just you,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's the work. That's the work that I do with people. I'm a coach and I'm developing some programs as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mel, for joining me today. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune in to this episode of the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. If you would like more of the Mamahood After Trauma community, make sure to look in the description of this episode for the link to become a Mamahood After Trauma Inner Circle member. Until next time, Mama, keep